that is my examiner walking away. I passed my instrument rating and I can't believe it.
Hi everyone and welcome back. Passing my instrument rating was not easy. In fact, it was one of the biggest challenges I've ever tackled. To make your instrument rating experience easier, here's my 10 tips on how to smash your skills test based on my mistakes and my experience. Enjoy!
Tip number 1. Practice on flight sim at home. Now, I got FS16 for like $20 and it really helped me during my initial training when I was learning to scan the instruments. From thereafter, it helped me with holds and CDFA approaches, the two things I was dreading the most. Being able to practice them at home really gave me a sort of security. If you're looking for an accurate representation of the G1000, I would recommend Mindstar's G1000, which is what I'm currently running. It does cost more than the actual sim, but trust me, it's really accurate and it has everything you need on it working. Tip number 2, keep track of your mistakes and write everything down. It's a really easy way to see what sort of mistakes you keep doing again and again. For example, I realized that I kept forgetting to pass the ATC information and QNH to the approach controller on my first contact by writing it down again and again and being like, oh my god, I keep forgetting to do this. I just got it in my brain, and on the day of my skills test, I did do it. Tip number 3. Now, overall, IFR training is all about workload management. Single pilot IFR operations is, by definition, the most demanding type of flying there is, because you're alone and there's so much you need to do and there's so much you can forget and so much that can eventually go wrong. You must realize that you have a limited capacity. In all cases, you must avoid overloading yourself, which is something I kept doing again and again during my training. For example, I was turning, leveling off, and I tried to speak to ATC at the same time. So of course I busted my altitude. So remember, aviate, navigate, communicate. This happened to me so many times during my training. Just fly the aircraft first, navigate, and then talk to ATC. Just prioritize stuff. Otherwise, it's gonna be just a complete mess. If you get in the habit of managing your workload early during your training, trust me, it's going to help you so much when you get in the aircraft and start flying those routes. Number 4, try to do as much of your planning as you can in advance and book your beacon slots early. It happened to me twice that I couldn't get the beacon slots I wanted for the flight I was booked for. I just walked into flight school 3 hours before my departure. I asked operations to book me a beacon slot for an ILS at Southend, and it turned out they didn't have any beacons for the rest of the day. So I tried LID, they didn't have slots either, and I ended that flight to Bournemouth. Had I booked slots the day before, I would have been okay. So you need to be flexible as well. You need to have a plan B in case plan A doesn't work. You also need to arrive at flight school at least 2 hours before your flight to give you all the time you need to carry out your flight planning without rushing. It's really embarrassing when it's time to go when you haven't done your mass and balance yet, for example. Plan your hold and your approach rate of descent in advance. When I say in advance, I literally mean on the ground, because you have your wind data, your enroute wind data, which is all you need. Do not use the surface wind though, because the wind at 2,000 feet or 3,000 or 4,000 will be very different than the surface wind. And this brings me to tip number 5. You need to be ahead of the aircraft. My examiner during my skills test really liked the fact that I got the 80s early in advance. When I switched to a new frequency, I set the next frequency on standby. You know, it's those little things that can really help you because when the time comes to fly the approach, you need to have everything set up. And here's another example I can think of during my skills test. ATC told me, after radar vectoring, expect routing direct deadling, and I didn't have deadling on my flight plan, so I didn't consider inserting it and having it on standby. So ATC went like, okay, direct deadling, and I had to type it in, wasting like 5-10 seconds. So it's something I could have done, which would have made life easier. So again, try to do as much as you can in advance. Tip number 6. Things will be much easier if you visualize them. Again, I'm speaking about those dreadful holds. You need to have a mental picture of the hold in your head and your hold entry as well. So what I do to help myself is, on the approach plate, I literally draw stuff up. The first thing I note is the direction of the hold. It's really embarrassing if it's a left-hand hold and you start turning right. I did do that in my training once and it was really embarrassing because there's no excuse to that. I also mark the wind direction to help me, visualize where the wind is coming from. Also, I mark the direction of the base turn, if it's a right base turn or a left base turn. I also highlight what rate of descent I should expect, and any tracks I need to follow, I would highlight. Just do anything you need to make it easier for you, because under the stress of the approach, you've been flying for an hour in the cruise and now you need to give you 100%. You really want to make things as simple and as easy as possible for you during the approach phase, which is the most demanding. Tip number 7. Strictly follow your ATO's SOPs, standard operating procedures. But if you feel like there's some small things you can do to help yourself, or if you're more comfortable doing something your own way, then feel free to do it, having discussed it with your instructor.
There are quite a few sort of little things that are in the standard procedures that are designed to make life easier. But if you're doing, if you're flying within limits and you're happy with your method, then don't change it.
For example, this brings me back to tip number 6. The SOPs I was taught call for the CDI to be set to the hold's inbound axis 1 mile before entering the hold. 1 mile. So what I do is I set it up 3 or 4 miles before the hold, so I can get a better picture of where I'm coming from in relation to the hold. In addition, I made my own pre-final approach fix check, which is RA, rudder trim centered, rate of descent for the approach. In case I forgot, you can just check your ground speed, look in your plate and judge your rate of descent at that point. And also A for altitude for go around. And guess what? Someone forgot to do these things during his training, so he developed a tactic, to fight it and start doing stuff properly. Also, you will be given a standard template for your navigation log or nav log. Of course, you can use your own if you find that it doesn't really help you, but you can customize the one you're given as well. By the way, this is the one I used on my skills test. I know, I'll just hang it on the wall or somewhere. So the one I was given has all the fuel planning on the bottom, but there's not really enough space on the front page to write notes. So what I did was actually fold it here, then this comes in, and you have all the space you need on the bottom to write your notes. Also make sure that you have all your frequencies, your Morse codes for identifying the beacons, because you need to identify them letter by letter. You can't just go, okay, we have a sound, that's an ident. No, you actually need to ident the beacons properly. And also have your DOCs, your designated operational coverages, for each and every beacon you're intending to use. Here you can see the actual headings for my hold. The wind was coming from the non-holding side, so I use double drift that day. I've got all my expected frequencies on this side, en route winds. Just remember, this is to help you, so customize it the way you want. Tip number 8. Now this is really quite practical, so if you haven't started your training yet, it might not really make sense. I found out that during holds, I always ended up slightly late and never ended up early. So my tip is, from the outbound leg of the hold, start your turn for the inbound leg slightly earlier than the time you calculated. I always ended up late. Even on my skills test, I calculated 1 minute 40 seconds. I turned earlier at 1 minute 30 seconds, and I still ended up almost 12 to 15 seconds late over the beacon. I think the reason that happens is because turns take time. It takes a finite amount of time for you to roll into the turn and pull slightly back and start the turn. So just take that into account and start turning slightly early. Also, when calculating your required rate of descent for different approaches, when you calculate, for example, you need something like 400 or 450 feet per minute, always go with the lower figure. Always underestimate your rate of descent. The reason being, it's much easier to correct for being high rather than being low, especially when you're on one engine. It's a real struggle. You'll push the power lever forward, you'll get out of balance, chances are you will lose your heading bug as well, and it will just make your approach sloppy. Whereas if you're slightly high, all you'll need to do is just pitch down a couple of degrees, bring the power slightly back if needed, and that's it, you've corrected for it. Tip number 9 is to know your aircraft. Again, a very specific example, but it's quite a useful advice. When you're getting the ATIS, keep the ATIS volume quite low and the ATC volume quite high. The reason being, you might miss some ATC calls. For some reason, ATC really likes to call you when you're listening to the ATIS. Don't know. So on the G1000, you can individually adjust volume for COM1 and COM2 by highlighting either COM1 and COP2 and using the volume button, which is really handy. What you cannot adjust though is the DME volume when identifying DMEs. So what I recommend is you turn the ATC volume up and you keep your finger on the DME ident. So if you hear your call sign, just press it to stop the ident and listen to what ATC has to tell you.
And DME.
Now, if you did miss an ATC call, the G1000 has a fantastic feature, which is playback. You can press the play button and listen to the latest recorded block of communications. I've only used it once, and it was during my mock test, but it worked. So it might just come in handy to you. And here's tip number 10. Now we need to talk about the skills test, the actual exam. My biggest advice is that you need to convince yourself it's just a normal flight. You know, by that time, you will have done so many routes that you will know your aircraft inside out. You will know what to expect from it. So there's no real reason to worry about your skills test. First of all, you will be much more familiar with your aircraft than your examiner is. Chances are he will not know what speeds you're going to use, so you need to tell him. Just let him know exactly what you're doing. And this shows confidence. You really need to show confidence on that day that you can actually be a PIC, have a passenger sitting next to you and, you know, take him from A to B or wherever he tells you to go to. Your examiner will be taking notes whether you're doing something very right or very wrong. Again, this is nothing new. That's exactly what your instructor was doing throughout your whole training. Now you will need to do some studying before the day of the skills test, because you will be asked some questions regarding your operation, which is IFR. I would recommend studying extensively the standards document 1, which has everything you need to know about the skills test, the structure, what the allowances, the margins are for the accuracy of your flight. I would also recommend revising some of your air law and operational procedures notes, especially anything that has to do with approach bands, IFR approaches. Just brush up really. Apart from that, especially if you haven't flown the UK before, I would really recommend studying the AIP. There is quite some info on IFR flights in the general section. You will also find the idents and the DOCs for the beacons you're intending to use. Now, CAP 413 is the radio telephony manual, and it's really detailed, has everything you need to know about radio telephony. Now, it's huge, so if you don't want to read all that, you can use the Skyway Code, which is a really good CAA document.
It's also important to know SERA, the Standardized European Rules of the Air, and the UK's exceptions to them. They can all be found in this neat document found in the description below. Last but not least, you need to know under which part you're operating, which is part NCO. Again, there's this neat website which makes it really easy to browse through the different rules. You can check out what rules apply to planning destination alternates, fuel policies, carriage of life rafts and life jackets, etc.
Just try to study as much as you can before the test, so you're prepared for any question you may be asked by your examiner. Also, get into the habit of flying attitudes. It's a very common failing mark for the IR exam to be chasing your performance instruments, especially your VSI. The VSI, especially on approach, is quite a useless instrument because it needs time. It's very laggy. It's very annoying when you're doing an approach and your altimeter is showing that you're descending, the VSI shows you're climbing, or the other way around, so you don't know which instrument to trust. Just fly an attitude. If you know that 4 degrees nose down will give you 500 feet a minute at 105 knots, fly that attitude and the VSI will settle itself. Do not chase the performance instruments. At some point during my training, I realized that I was chasing them, and when I started flying attitudes and letting the VSI settle itself, that's when my approaches started getting really precise. It's best to just fly the attitude and wait and see what happens to the VSI, rather than overcorrecting, going up and down, chasing the instrument. Now, I've also been asked by friends who are doing the hour building now how they can actually prepare for this very advanced training. All I can say is try to fly accurately. Maintain your altitude plus or minus 50 if you can. Maintain your heading without exception. Make all of your temps rate 1, and just ask your instructor or your pilot friend to go for some flying under the hood, so you can get into the habit of scanning your instruments.
So that's it. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Just one thing, don't be afraid of the instrument rating, as it will open up an exciting new world in your training, so make the most of it and do enjoy it. Any questions you may have, please feel free to write them in the comment section below. And until next time, fly safe.